Part 1 of Extracts from a Diary kept by the Reverend R. Burrows during HEKE'S War in the North in 1845. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Preface and Introduction. Preface. Some years before the late Sir William Martin left New Zealand, he did me the honour to read the diary, extracts from which are embodied in the following pages, and he advised me not to allow the manuscript to be lost, as it contained what might form a chapter in a future history of New Zealand. I well remember Sir William remarking that although HEKE'S War was confined to one part of the island, and his followers were comparatively few, yet it represented a crisis in the early history of the colonisation of the country, and that the facts and circumstances connected therewith ought not to be lost to our children. Although I have allowed many years to pass away since those suggestions were made, I always had such implicit confidence in Sir William Martin's judgment, that I all along intended some day to act upon his advice. Having been confined to my home for the last month, I have employed my time in putting together what follows. R.B. St. Stephen's Road, February 17th, 1886. Extracts from Reverend R. Burrows' Diary. For the information of those who may be inclined to read at their leisure the following extracts from a journal kept during the time of what is known as HEKE'S War, a brief outline of the facts and circumstances which occurred prior to the commencement of hostilities between the Government and Heke may serve as an introduction. It is tolerably well known by all who have read any one of the many books and pamphlets which have been written on New Zealand, that when Captain Hobson, the first governor, landed in the Bay of Islands, he found a considerable number of Europeans, Americans, and some of other nations congregated in a little bay known as Kororareka, the present site of the town of Russell. There were also two Maori pas standing in the forefront, containing as tolerably permanent occupants about 100. This mixed population, making altogether from 600 to 1000, had their own laws, which were not of a very defined character, nor very rigidly carried out. Perhaps the least said as to the social and moral character of many of the inhabitants, the better. Among the number were to be found some who were absent from Sydney and other penal settlements without leave. Many of these, on the arrival of a mounted police force from New South Wales, made themselves scarce. The trade carried on in the bay at this time was chiefly between the American whalers and the Maoris, the latter exchanging their wares of potatoes, kumara, fish, etc., for blankets, guns, tomahawks, etc. Several merchants had also established themselves in the bay, and were doing a brisk trade both with the natives and the whaling vessels. There was likewise a considerable export of flax, timber, etc. Shortly after the arrival of the governor, a meeting of most of the influential chiefs living in the districts of the Bay of Islands, Hokianga and Kaipara, was convened at Waitangi, which resulted in the signing of the famous Treaty of Waitangi on the 5th February 1840. Upon this followed in due time the establishment of Her Majesty's Customs. The nature and necessity of this tax, levied upon all imported goods, especially upon goods from America, the natives did not understand, but were soon made to feel by the higher prices put upon the articles they purchased that such a law existed, and there were not wanting, as may be supposed, among the white population, those who told the natives that this was the outcome of their having signed the Treaty of Waitangi, and thus ceded their country to the Queen. The flagstaff which had been set up on the hill above the town, and from which was flying the English ensign, was often pointed to as a sign that the manor, power, of the native chiefs had been superseded by that of the Queen. During the short stay in the bay of Captain Hobson and his party after the signing of the treaty, an attempt was made to establish law and order, which only partially succeeded. Up to May 1841 we were supposed to be governed from New South Wales, and a Lieutenant Smart and some half-dozen mounted police had been sent down to help in the administration of justice by upholding the hands of the resident magistrate, who had been sent by the New South Wales Government. Many attempts made to bring delinquents under the power of the law failed, especially in the case of runaway sailors, who had only to find their way to some native settlement, and they were safe, as long as the Maoris thought proper to give them shelter. The masters of the whalers, however, had adopted the best method they had at hand to get their runaways returned to them, namely paying £2 or £3 per head for each man brought back. It was no uncommon sight, therefore, to witness a canoe manned by 2 or more natives, landing on the beach, or conducting up the side of his ship some unfortunate culprit with his hands fast bound with flax. Drunken quarrels were frequent on the beach between some of the inhabitants and the sailors, as well as among the settlers themselves. The magistrate, very wisely, did not encourage the interference of the policeman in every case, but the combatants were either left to fight it out, or some person or persons of influence managed to put a stop to the quarrel. The parson's services were occasionally called in. As may be supposed, the magistrates' court, when a sitting was held, did not always present the quiet and orderly appearance the law required, nor were all the decisions strictly according to English law or justice. One case to which the writer of this was eye-witness may be named as an instance of how the law was often sought to be administered. A vessel named the Sukabaya arrived from South America with a cargo of horses, which sold at very high prices, varying from £30 to £70 each, but the vessel was condemned as unseaworthy. She was sold to the highest bidder, who happened to be the late Mr. Benjamin Turner of the Manukau Road. 3 men were employed by him to break her up, and a written agreement entered into. The men soon found that they had made a bad bargain, and applied to Mr. Turner for additional pay. The application was refused, and the men struck work. On examining the agreement entered into between Turner and the men, it was found that only 1 out of the 3 had signed it. This one expressed his willingness to go on with the contract, but his companions refused. Mr. Turner, however, was not to be treated in this way. A summons was at once obtained, and the 3 men sought for to appear before the magistrate and his coadjutor. The 2 who had not signed the agreement refused to obey the summons, and took themselves off, but Gibb, the name of the one who had signed, was then and there taken into court, and in less than half an hour sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment with hard labour, and at the end of the term to return to the vessel and finish his contract. This decision was no sooner known outside than the less law-abiding of the population were for breaking open the hut, which then served as a lock-up, and releasing the prisoner. Wiser counsels, however, prevailed, and one of the residents undertook to obtain a hearing from the governor, who was then living at what is now called Old Russell. Having heard the facts of the case, His Excellency expressed his surprise in very warm language at the decision of the bench, remarking that the case was a civil one, and therefore not within the jurisdiction of a magistrate. The magistrate happened to be at the time on the wharf below, and the governor sent his orderly to ask him to come to his office. "Mr. B, is it so," asked His Excellency, "that you and S have sentenced a man to 3 months' imprisonment with hard labour for a breach of contract?" The magistrate replied, "We treated him as a hired servant, sir, and made it a criminal offence." "By what law?" "By a recent act of the New South Wales Legislature." Captain Hobson reached from his shelf a book called the Australian Magistrate, and requested to be shown the act. As the administrator of the law required time to look up the act applicable to the case, he was given till 10 o'clock next morning, when, unless it was made clear to the governor that their decision was according to the law, he would have to release the prisoner. Suffice it to say that before 11 o'clock the following morning, Gibb was landed from the police boat on what is now known as Russell Beach, and amid the shouts and rejoicing of half the people of the place, was set at liberty. Shortly after this, the governor and his staff left the Bay of Islands for Waitemata Harbour, where the survey of the present city of Auckland was then being carried on. The removal of the government to Auckland led, as a matter of course, to the departure of many of the European population from the Bay of Islands. A considerable number, however, remained. The whalers continued to visit the port in considerable numbers. The writer of this counted at one time 42 anchored between what is now called Russell Point and the loading ground, and a brisk trade continued to be carried on. Even before Captain Hobson arrived in the bay as governor, Hone Heke was known among both the native and European population as a busybody in other men's matters. On the signing of the treaty at Waitangi, he had given considerable trouble. He had married the daughter of the celebrated Hongi, which gave him a position of influence among Ngapuhi he would not otherwise have had. As early as 1841, Heke had managed to get around him a party chiefly of young men who were ready to do his bidding. With these he frequently visited different parts of the district, and soon found pretexts for demanding utu payment for some alleged grievance, and generally returned to his home with spoil of some kind. Nor was his meddling confined to his own race. He was sometimes heard of amongst Europeans, either as the arbitrator in some dispute between the white man and the Maori, or in some purely white men's affairs, where he was encouraged by one party to take up their cause against the other. In May 1842, Bishop Selwyn, the Bishop of New Zealand, arrived, and shortly afterwards took up his temporary residence at the Waimate, a church mission station about 12 miles inland from the Bay of Islands, where he set on foot St. John's College. The Bishop and Heke never got on amicably together. Although the latter was always friendly to the missionaries, he regarded with considerable jealousy the movements of the Bishop, and in several instances was a source of annoyance to him. His lordship appealed to Heke in his capacity as bishop, and tried to impress upon him that as a member of the church, and as one who had acted as a lay reader, he was in duty bound to obey him and leave off his troublesome ways. Heke, however, did not acknowledge any episcopal authority over him, and the bishop, not knowing then the native characters so well as he did after living and travelling more among them, presumed upon his office to reprimand the proud man, reminding him that he had come to New Zealand under the authority of the Queen. This did not tend to mend matters, and up to the departure of the bishop and his staff in October 1844, Heke did not treat his lordship with that respect which was due to his office. During 1842 and 1843, Heke, whose home was supposed to be Kaikohe, was heard of in different parts of the district, interfering in matters with which he had no right to meddle. His visits to the bay became more frequent, and his intimacy with some of the settlers, especially with those who were not of English birth, became more marked. He was told by those who were not friendly to the English rule of the way in which other countries had been taken possession of, and the aborigines ill-treated and driven off their lands, etc., etc. The missionaries were often appealed to as to the truth of these statements, and as they had taken an active part in obtaining signatures to the Treaty of Waitangi, they were sometimes accused, in no measured terms, of having deceived the natives by withholding from them these facts. The strong reasons always given by the old missionaries for assisting in the establishment of British rule in New Zealand were the then state of the country and the attempts that were being made by the French and by the New Zealand Company to colonise the country, and it is a well-known fact that we were not any too soon in obtaining possession of the whole of New Zealand. Many an hour was spent by the late Archdeacon Williams and other missionaries in pointing out to Heke the benefits which had been secured to them by the Treaty of Waitangi. Then, again, there were other influences at work which tended to prejudice the minds of Heke and others against British rule, and the flag flying on the hill above the town pointed at as a tohu sign that their country had gone from them. Early in 1844, Heke's visits had become very frequent to the bay, and it became clear to those who watched his movements and conversed with him on various subjects that he was contemplating mischief. In July he went to the bay with a considerable number of followers, and after committing several depredations both among Maoris and Europeans, he found a grievance at Kororareka itself, where lived a man of the name of Lord, who had married a native woman, which woman was accused of having cursed Heke. He stripped the house of the European, and afterward ascended the hill with his party and cut down the flagstaff. After committing other depredations, he returned inland. The news of this act of Heke's having reached Auckland, the governor sent to Sydney for troops, and some 160 men, commanded by Colonel Hume, were sent down and forwarded to the bay. In the meantime, Tamate Wakanene, who lived at Hokianga, and whose name and doings will often come before us in our after jottings, got together some of the leading chiefs of the districts around, and met Governor Fitzroy at the Waimate. At this meeting His Excellency was induced to accept the assurance of these chiefs that they would keep Heke in check, and they, as a pledge of their faithfulness, offered to make any compensation required for the injury done by Heke, begging at the same time that the troops who had now arrived in the bay might be sent away. The governor acceded to their request, and asked for 10 muskets as an acknowledgment of their determination to fulfil their pledge. The said firearms were at once laid at His Excellency's feet. Their quality was not first rate. The soldiers who had been landed at Kororareka, and had pitched their tents in the little bay behind the town named Matauhi, generally called Matavia, were now ordered to re-embark. A circumstance occurred whilst the soldiers were encamped in this bay, which might have proved most disastrous, had the mistake not have been discovered at the instant. The friendly natives from the Rawiti and the immediate neighbourhood had assembled at a short distance from the camp, and some with firearms and some without, among whom were also a few women, were drawing near, intending in a friendly way to dance the war dance. The officer in command of the troops had not been informed of this movement, and mistaking the act as a hostile one, he mustered his men, and had given the command to stand their arms and take good aim. Just in the very nick of time, the Maoris were checked in their forward rush, which always precedes the war dance, and the commanding officer informed that the visit was one of welcome. Thus the disaster was avoided. Either before or immediately after the troops left the bay, a second flagstaff was erected, and the English ensign hoisted as before. The native chiefs who had met Governor Fitzroy at the Waimate returned to their homes, and for a short time matters remained tolerably quiet. Before Governor Fitzroy left the bay, he declared it a free port. Heke was kept well informed of all that took place at the meeting with the governor, and made sport of the pledge given by the handing up of a dozen or so of rusty muskets. In October of this year, 1844, the writer, who had been living at Kororareka from April 1840, ministering both to the English congregation and the natives, removed to the Waimate to take charge of that station on the final departure of the Bishop of New Zealand and his whole staff to the Tamaki. I had become tolerably well acquainted with Heke by seeing him on his several visits to the bay, but our opportunities for meeting and for conversations were more frequent after my removal inland. By the remarks he made on one or two occasions in reference to the meeting of the governor with Wakanene and other chiefs, and the erection of a second flagstaff, it was not difficult to see that he was bent upon cutting that down likewise, which we know shortly afterwards took place. This was done, however, in a much quieter way than the former had been, and without any pretext for so doing, further than his determination to have his own way. What wounded Heke's pride more than anything else which took place at the meeting with Governor Fitzroy was the chiefs present pledging themselves to keep him in order, and to prevent his doing further mischief. "Let Waka," he said, "keep to his own side of the island, Hokianga, and not interfere with me." The destruction of the second flagstaff by Heke was followed shortly afterward by the preparation on the part of the government of another of more lofty pretensions, and in due time it was erected, the lower part cased in iron, a blockhouse built, and a moat of considerable dimensions and depth dug around it. Some 30 soldiers were sent to the bay to protect the staff. Whilst these works were going on, Heke was not idle. His messengers might be seen and heard of in different parts of the district, as far north as Mongonui, and as far south as Whangarei, as well as in the interior. Heke himself was almost constantly on the move with a small party of his followers, and we came in contact 2 or 3 times at our station Waimate, where at this time we were carrying on a native girls' school of considerable dimensions. He encouraged us, in words at least, to continue our work, but blamed us for the efforts we were making to keep our immediate people from joining him. We lost, at the end of the year 1844, several of our elder scholars. Some were taken away by their friends, and 2 or 3 left voluntarily. But after the holidays, the school reopened, with some 40 girls. It now became evident that further mischief was brewing. Small parties were seen passing through the settlement, Waimate, armed. A visit to Kaikohe, Heke's home, and a conversation with him, convinced us that another move to the bay, with a much larger party than he had before managed to muster, was intended. On the morrow I rode down to Paihia to report to Archdeacon Williams my visit to Kaikohe, and the result of my interview with Heke. The Archdeacon had recently been up the Kawakawa, where he found Kawiti and a number of the natives of that district evidently preparing for mischief. Indeed, they had already commenced plundering some 2 or 3 of the settlers in the neighbourhood. Both of us had been treated with civility by these men, and they heard in silence our warnings, Heke only replying to my remarks that he was mate sick for some fish, and he should probably go to the sea shortly with his net. During the short interval which intervened between this and the 3rd of March 1845, Archdeacon Williams, Mr. Davis, and myself were in and out among the natives of our several districts, using our influence to prevent as many as possible from joining Heke. My journal dates from March 3rd, 1845, from which time I kept a tolerably correct, and on some days a very full account of events as they transpired. The following record, therefore, will be extracts from the said journal, interwoven with such remarks and explanations as may be thought necessary to make the whole as intelligible as possible to the ordinary reader. End of Part 1.